Portanto, could Portugal survive a Spanish military invasion? Isto é incrível. Tipo, nos dias atuais, será que Portugal podia sobreviver a uma invasão espanhola? Vamos ver.
One of the EU's biggest countries, almost encircling the noticeably smaller Portugal. The disparity between the two extends to their population, economy and armed forces.
Okay.
So, if, hypothetically speaking, Spain wanted to rekindle some of the centuries-old animosities between the two and invade Portugal, could it do it within a year?
Yeah, é isso. Within a year. Ok. Vinkov's battlegrounds.
Spain and Portugal had centuries of disagreements, competition as colonial powers, and even wars. Today, their relations are good, but does that mean either of them is letting down their guard? Say the war starts suddenly, with no outside party interference. Portugal would certainly be in a pickle, since it trades a lot with its neighbor, but more about that later. The Spanish ground combat troop forces are several times bigger.
Okay.
The numbers shown include active army troops and marines. Portugal is leaning a bit more on its reserve component, though. The figure represents the part of the reserves which either train periodically throughout the year or have recently left the army, so they're still fairly well trained. Both sides could, of course, mobilize and conscript many more into the army. The two figures shown aren't directly comparable, though. The Portuguese one shows a planned force for which there is some kind of organizational structure. The Spanish figure concerns overall mobilization potential, if they conscript most of the appropriate population.
Mano, a cena é que nós... aqui há uma coisa que não está a ser tida em conta neste vídeo, é que se fosse uma invasão, íamos lutar em terreno português. E ninguém luta melhor em terreno português do que os portugueses. Não se esqueçam desta merda. Não se esqueçam desta porcaria que eu estou a dizer, porque as táticas que nós vamos ter no nosso próprio país são graves. Eu acho que a Espanha não está pronta.
As estimated by their Ministry
Fazemos já aqui uma tática do quadrado.
Considering the population difference, with a similar mobilization push, Portugal should be able to raise some 500,000 troops. But to mobilize so much of their actual civilian population would take upward of half a year, even in the biggest emergency.
Certo.
Other resources, such as their paramilitary forces, might aid them in the meantime. Both Spain and Portugal have a national policing force, gendarmerie of a sort, that would likely get used as some sort of aid in defenses. The topography of the area is fairly conducive to large military formations. That would not go in Portugal's favor. The one thing that would help Portugal at first is initial positioning of units. Being more compact and having no threats from the sea, Portugal could start fortifying its borders right away.
Epá, é já submarinos para cima deles, meu.
Or even going into Spain at certain locations, if it deems it necessary. For example...
Olha, metíamos uma bandeira espanhola num dos submarinos, atacávamos Gibraltar e esperávamos que os ingleses entrassem por aqui dentro outra vez.
If a quick raid over the border could result in a local force concentration superiority, before the Spaniards assemble.
Primeiro, está errado. Os espanhóis nunca atacavam da Catalunha, ok? Mais depressa, os catalões atacavam Espanha por nós. Portanto... Vou-vos já dizer que temos de ter em conta que há pessoas em Espanha que são mais portugueses do que espanhóis. Portanto, ou querem mais ser portugueses do que espanhóis.
7th and 11th brigades are quite close to Portugal and might not be able to pull out entirely in time if the Portuguese try for a rapid short-term incursion. But Portugal lacks its own forces up in the north, across the border from the Spanish 7th Brigade, so it's questionable if it would make it in time with sufficient forces.
Eles não atacam
and the topography is somewhat more coarse.
Ninguém explica que estes gajos são todos... Claro, é o que eu estou a dizer. Estes gajos atacavam mais depressa a Espanha do que Portugal. E lá mandávamos lá um diplomata no dia a seguir, queriam todos lutar por Portugal. Eles adoram Portugal. Eles queriam a Galiza, os galegos são mais, desculpa, enganei-me, não é Catalunha. Os galegos querem mais lutar por Portugal do que por Espanha. Não é Galiza, desculpa, enganei-me, porra.
More hills, which is again not suitable for quickly moving large concentrations of vehicles.
Os galegos até falam português, a maior parte deles.
Does have quite a concentration of forces, including rapid reaction units, in their center. So the Spanish 11th Brigade might very well get shelled and routed from their bases, probably having to leave some of their equipment behind. Of course, such early success would mean little in the overall scheme of things. Spanish air forces would get up in the air.
Mas nós não íamos avançar sobre Espanha. Isto está estúpido, nós não íamos avançar sobre Espanha, íamos só proteger o nosso país. Era uma invasão espanhola só, não é? Não somos nós.
And probably suppress Portuguese air forces within days. The Spanish side has almost 6 times as many combat planes, and except for their navy's Harriers, they are on average more capable than the Portuguese F-16s. Spain has a token number of cruise missiles, but they wouldn't really be that important to Spain anyway, with so many more fighters than Portugal and the fact that Portugal lacks modern...
Não, 30 F-16 os que existem, os que conseguem voar são para aí 15.
SAM systems of decent reach, even the bombing raids with laser and satellite-guided bombs would be impossible to prevent for the Portuguese. Portuguese old Chaparral SAMs wouldn't even be able to reach Spanish high-flying planes. On the other hand, Spanish fighter jets would be a bit more free to act offensively, as Spain has a rather robust SAM system network, which would endanger possible Portuguese air attacks. The Spanish would eventually be able to assemble their ground forces around the Portuguese borders, and push into Portugal within a week or a month, depending on just what kind of force they'd want to start the offensive with. As mentioned, they have more ground forces, but not all would be available for the invasion of Portugal at the start of the war. Both sides, but Spain especially, have overseas territories, which have their own army contingents. Portugal maintains 2 infantry battalions at the Azores and another one at Madeira. Spain has much larger forces stationed overseas. They have a full brigade worth of troops at the Canary Islands, and 1 brigade worth of troops at Ceuta and Melilla each. Those 2 are Spanish enclaves.
Mas se os Açores entravam na equação, a base aérea dos Estados Unidos tinha que entrar na equação também.
Surrounded by Moroccan
os Estados Unidos davam-nos uns caças para irmos atacar.
Shores. And they also have roughly a half a brigade at the Balearic Islands in the Med. Without waiting for the reshuffling of forces, Spain could thus pour into Portugal with roughly 8 brigades worth of troops, minus whatever possible losses of that 1 brigade that they suffered at the hands of the Portuguese early raids over the border. Spain is, however, not just numerically superior, but also better equipped for a ground war. They've got roughly 10 times more tanks. While Portuguese tanks are as modern as the best Spanish tanks, the sheer difference in numbers ruins any tech advantage Portugal might have.
Bro, reparem, certo, tudo bem, mas nós temos esquadrão de cavalaria. Mandei os cavalos, caralho. Vamos embora.
When it comes to other combat vehicles, Portugal is still behind.
É meter meia dúzia de gajos num cavalo com uma granada e rebenta com os
Though the difference is not as pronounced as with tanks. Portuguese armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles are generally lighter, while the Spanish have more and heavier tracked.
Isto não está bem contado.
Vehicles. The topography of the area across most of the border is fairly flat. Farms and
toda a gente tem noção disso, man.
Hills without major urban centers. Spanish armored formations, not really threatened from the air, would have a field day. Up north, there are some mountains, so a push from the directions of A Coruña or even from Salamanca into northern Portugal probably wouldn't proceed as quickly. And in the south, the river Guadiana marks the border and would likely be populated by Portuguese troops in time on its western banks. Guadiana is very wide there, between 100 and 200 meters. The Spanish would first have to secure a bridgehead, which they would eventually probably succeed at. With the air power and artillery edge, the defenders would be suppressed. Spain does have over 4 times as many artillery pieces, and has a more robust inventory of aircraft useful for air insertions, be it via
eles também pertencem à NATO.
Drops or
isto é sem intervenção estrangeira, malta.
Helicopter assaults. In addition to the transport helicopter edge, Spain also operates attack helicopters, which could come in handy in assault ops over the rivers or beaches.
Mano, mas aqui também há uma coisa que não está a ser contabilizada, que é o kit de unhas. Alguma vez achamos que os espanhóis têm mais kit de unhas do que os portugueses?
Push through the middle of Portugal would come quickly, possibly forking into 2 main thrusts.
Pá, isto era já fazer uma milícia, meu. Era já guerra de guerrilha, ou caraças, pá.
One marching towards Lisbon and another going south to cut off the Portuguese forces there. Lisbon itself would be somewhat protected by the river Tagus, which snakes southwards as well.
Os galegos lutavam por nós.
Going north of it to circumvent it would be harder and slow.
E estes gajos também não sabem que... Bem, nós íamos incitar uma guerra civil em Espanha com uma pinta. Começávamos logo a mandar mensagens para os nossos amigos, tipo, nas regiões que querem ser autónomas, a convidá-los para fazer parte de uma união com os portugueses para libertar os Estados espanhóis que estão em dissidência. Estão a ver? Começámos a mandar mensagens a dizer: olha, amigos, é assim, vocês querem se libertar de Espanha, da mainland, pá, nós ajudamos essa merda, vamos todos invadir Madrid. E começavam a levar porrada de todos os lados.
Or for Spain, as the hills are plentiful there and their armored and even Air Force edge would not be as pronounced there. While the ground offensives would roll over mainland Portugal, a war over the seas would be waged as well.
Pois, isto também é uma coisa que ninguém está a ver, que às duas eles não trabalham, porque estão a dormir a cesta.
Spain would have two main goals for its navy: to cut off merchant shipping going into Portugal.
Para mais que aqui era começar a guerra às 6 da manhã, que eles ainda estão a dormir. As lojas em Espanha só abrem às 11, eles agora vinham para a guerra às 10, não.
Trying to choke its economy and to
eles lá almoçam tarde que dói.
Take Portuguese islands in the Atlantic. For both to succeed, the Portuguese navy would first need to be neutralized. After that, Spain's own overseas territories, such as the Canary Islands, would be safe. Luckily for Spain, Portugal has precisely 0 ships for amphibious assaults.
Temos os submarinos do Portas, é? Como assim?
The last of their Bombarda-class landing craft were retired in 2015, and even though a larger landing ship was planned as a replacement, it has yet to be procured.
A gente não precisa dessa merda, pá. É pegar nas caravelas antigas e vamos lá.
Out in the Atlantic, the Portuguese would be hard-pressed to maintain their islands, let alone endanger Spanish ones. The Spanish Navy is larger and better equipped. Spanish ships carry longer-range Standard 1 and Standard 2 air defense missiles, while Portuguese vessels have to make do with shorter-range Sea Sparrows. Portugal's best bet, navy-wise, would be to make use of their submarines. 2 boats compared to Spain's 3, but the Portuguese ones are quite modern, with...
Temos ogivas nucleares e tudo, não têm mísseis, mas está lá, mas está lá o espaço para pôr um míssil nuclear. Era só pedi-las emprestadas.
Very quiet and very good for ambushes. So going after the Azores or the island of Madeira would not be without its risks for the Spanish. Spain does have a smaller aircraft carrier with Harrier jets, but it may be more useful for launching helicopter assaults, for which it was also designed. But it's likely Spain would be in no rush to actually take those islands and risk their big ships to submarine attacks. Most likely Spain would first hunt for the Portuguese ships. Months later, a decent part of the Spanish Air Force would also be available to support the landings, and air assets would possibly neutralize some of the Portuguese submarine threat. In the meantime, at roughly the half-year point after the start of the war, Spanish ground forces would find themselves in heavy fighting for the urban centers. By then, Spain would have many more civilians mobilized into the army, and they would be even somewhat competent after 6 months of training. The Portuguese mobilization effort would be somewhat hampered by the fact that a fair part of their country would be occupied, although most of the population in Portugal does live between Porto and Lisbon. Eventually, the Azores and Madeira would fall. Spain would likely lose some ships in the process and many soldiers on the beaches, but the Portuguese troops on the islands would be low on supplies.
Eu acho que estes gajos não estão, tipo, não se está aqui a contar a resiliência dos madeirenses e dos açorianos.
Supplies within main...
É que reparem, alguma vez isto é sequer realista, tipo, os Açores caírem para os espanhóis? Tipo, alguma vez os Estados Unidos deixavam os Açores serem tomados para os espanhóis? Isto é de malucos. É de loucos este vídeo.
And Portugal would also be quite problematic. Spain supplies roughly a third of all Portuguese imports, but even worse, a lot of their other imports from the EU come via Spain. All those would cease coming in. The rest of their imports are...
Tá bem, e a cortiça? Onde é que vai a cortiça para os espanhóis? Não há!
Are by merchant ships, but eventually all the major...
Olha, vai começar a acabar o vinho em Espanha, quero ver.
The ports would be blockaded by Spain.
Sei, mano, foi um vídeo que
the flow of goods into Portugal would slow down to a trickle within months.
Pois, e a exportação de
pastel
de nata
would become scarce at some point. While Portugal nominally achieves some 80% level of self-sufficiency when it comes to food production, a lot of that comes from the flatlands in the south, which would mostly be occupied by Spain. And after oil and gas runs out, the Portuguese economy would be fighting for survival. So the Portuguese war effort would eventually atrophy to light infantry fighting in the hills and urban centers, as there would be no supplies for anything else in the last several months of the first year of the war. The Spanish economy is not only larger, but their defense industry is more diverse and could help in keeping their army restocked. While Portugal's most important defense items are personal weapons, Spain can also make its own combat vehicles, mortars, AT guns, ships and partially various aircraft. Considering all that, it's not even surprising that the war would end with a fairly easy Spanish victory. The number of casualties would be first and foremost decided by the will to fight. If the Portuguese would refuse to capitulate, the Spanish might eventually suffer hundreds of thousands of dead troops by the end of the war, though that would come at the cost of whole generations of Portuguese obliterated. Whether it would be worth it against such odds would be questionable.
Pá, olhem, já lutámos por odds piores no passado. É aquilo que eu tenho a dizer. This theory is wrong because o caralho está foda. Excelente comentário. É exatamente isto. Concordo em absoluto. Sério, não, obrigado pelos 27 meses, man. Thanks, man. Obrigadíssimo. This theory is wrong because o caralho está foda. Portugal in the world's overachiever is a small nation, few natural resources, small population, and that have bad luck in the earliest geopolitical positioning. Nonetheless, Portugal has been able to achieve amazing and wonderful things in its history. Portugal managed to do things first and do it against all odds. They established a commercial empire before the UK and the Netherlands. To achieve, they were able to assimilate countries with several times the population. Countries that today speak Portuguese, while bigger, more powerful countries, never managed to make a significant impact on their conquered lands. They sailed to places other people were afraid to go. Their diplomacy managed to make them vital to every nation they encounter and eager to trade with them. The cities of Portugal still glow with the unparalleled beauty of an architectural style that reflect their imperial past and are a testament of the oceanic character of such empire. They were ruthless in their colonies, but they managed to maintain their control for over 500 years, where other stronger nations couldn't. The impact in the globe of Portugal now is silenced due to the greater noise of bigger, more powerful neighbors and alliances that made them weaker in the long term. But we should never forget that, yet silenced, the echoes of the Portuguese actions were the first notes on the concert that will eventually become the European era of domination. Love to my Portuguese brothers and viva Portugal, coño. Grande espanhol, caralho. Foda-se. Engraçado como o espanhol tem tanta coisa bonita para dizer sobre o nosso país, hein? Já viram?